recording this session, so then we can share that with those who are unable to make it today. So I'll be covering these particular aspects of workforce development and encourage you to send me some questions as we go. As we look at what a systematic approach to supply chain management looks like in an organization, what I would like us to do is to look at these particular items on the screen. When I've been speaking to a number of people, reading reports, assessments of supply chain, these particular issues come up regularly. That is, of the regular provision of training. You feel like that it's a never-ending cycle, difficulty convincing people that you need supply chain focused workers, and that it's hard to motivate and retain staff in supply chain management systems in country. This is the situation which many of you are working in now, and questions and comments that I hear often from the field. And if you're suffering these particular issues, then this particular session is going to help you understand these in a more detailed way. Some of you have experience in different parts of international development in different countries or in different projects, or from the work that you've undertaken up to this point in time. And so a lot of you will have seen on the screen what I'm showing as the health system strengthening building blocks from the World Health Organization. These building blocks remind us that for a health system to work, you have to have good services, workforce, information, products, money, and good governance. And the supply chain is part of this much bigger health system, and is something that we need to think about systematically as we seek to move a supply chain system from where it is to where we want it to be, a mature system sustainably providing products for the country. Many of you will have seen this particular graphic, which is a supply chain management graphic. And I've put it here just to remind us of the complexity of the system that we're working in and that we are trying to strengthen. I wanted to remind you that in addition to this selection, quantification, storage, distribution, and ultimate use of the products, that we have this quality monitoring system that is working in a good system, but in a little writing in the middle. We have logistics management information system, pipeline, budgeting, supervision, evaluation, and sort of hiding in here is organization and staffing. But human resources is actually the backbone of any organization and is a cross-cutting theme right across supply chain. But what's interesting, in the same way that supply chain itself is often not thought about as a priority for governments, the human resources systems within a supply chain organization are also often not thought of very well. I'd like to give you a little bit of thinking around capacity development. Now, this particular graph I'm showing is from a couple of researchers called Potter and Bruff. They've done a lot of work in a lot of development areas. But I want you to notice this little bit in the middle that says knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So that little bit in the middle is where our training would take place, knowledge, skills, and attitudes. But what this pyramid tells us is that you need a lot more than training if you're going to have a sustainable, growing system. So on the top, you'll see tools. There's no point having training if you don't have the tools that you need to do your work. So this could be forms, they could be computer systems, etc. in our context. But tools by themselves don't work. You need skills, knowledge, and attitudes for them to be effective. But skills, knowledge, and attitudes are only effective if you've got staff and infrastructure. And staff and infrastructure, in turn, can only be effective if you've got management, structures, roles, and systems in place. And again, these management structures, roles, and systems only make sense if you really understand the local context. So you can see there's this sort of requirements as we move down the pyramid. And conversely, as you move up, you can understand the context, but to understand the context then gives you an effective use of management structures and roles, which effectively means you can use staff and infrastructure, etc. I like to use this graph when I'm talking to people to help them understand that capacity development is much more than just training. Within our project, this is our Psm Technical Framework. and this has been put out by Alan Pringle, Director of System Strengthening. And it's to remind us that we are in the countries is where the action happens as it relates to governments. If you are from the field today, then you're part of a team in country working with government and working with the local mission in order to help strengthen that country's supply chain. Myself today, representing headquarters, is our role to help support you in that through providing, in this context, global technical approaches, so thinking, resource thinking, and ideas and approaches to help you in your context. And USAID, they provide further programmatic considerations. You will have seen guidance from PEPFAR, from PMI. You may have seen guidance from CSL and MCH, which are different objectives that USAID have from their programs and their funding. In a particular country, we also have the enablers, which are the people, the processes, the technology, the finance, and the other local government aspects. And then as we think about innovation, we also have these other things which we call disruptors, like big data, mHealth, economic development. And for those with English as a second language, the word disruptors here is actually a positive word. The word disruptors in the English language is now being used as a positive word to describe Airbnb, Uber, those types of new businesses, because they're disrupting the way we do business to the benefit of the consumer. And so this is this positive word. But all of these bubbles come together to form the local thinking and application. So when you're working in your countries, what you're doing is working with government to improve the local supply chain. And as a project, the country directors will have seen guidance from Alan Pringle and Doris talking about developing 3 to 5 year Psm strategies. These are strategies to try to answer the question, what are we going to leave behind as a project after the next 3 to 5 years? What is it that we're going to leave behind when the project finishes? And these particular strategies then convert into yearly work plans. And we're currently moving into the work plan cycle. The point that I want to make is that often we're so busy doing activities in our countries and against our work plans that we forget the big picture. And the big picture here is, what are we going to leave behind? What's going to be our legacy? And we need to then think backwards to think, what is our strategy in system strengthening for the supply chain to make that legacy a reality in the country? And in today's presentation, we're going to talk specifically about the workforce development aspect of that. I hope that's clear to you. The interesting thing I want to really also emphasize is, although you can start in many different places when it comes to strategy, unless any organization has effective governance and leadership, then sustainable capacity development is just not possible. So if you've not thought about this particular aspect as you think about your country context and how you're going to strengthen it, then this is a great place to start, is thinking about the governance and leadership when it comes to the supply chain in your country. A number of people who have joined the call, welcome. You've reached the Workforce Development webinar from the PSM. Invite you in the chat on the screen to type in your name and your country and what position you hold. Gives us an idea who's on the call, and others can see as well. As I move along thinking about this governance piece, I want to point to you about what's the end result that we would be looking for workforce development. What would good look like if we got to the end of our project? I want to share this with you because I think this is interesting. Our desired paradigm, or what we'd love to see, would be qualified staff hired and contracted for supply chain management positions in government, appropriate career incentives, high staff satisfaction, supply chain jobs desirable and qualifications sought, and national institutions providing relevant qualifications so that we would have a sustainable workforce environment producing good staff. What's interesting is that for this to work, we need a long-term focus. If we're stuck in a yearly work plan type thinking, then we're not going to get to the long-term focus. Human resource systems typically take 5 to 10 years to change. 5 to 10 years. That's a long time. I think the example Mozambique that we've been working on from headquarters with the local team. And just last year, we got the opportunity to submit a submission to the Ministry of Health to consider to have an extra speciality for healthcare workers so that they could be recognised as supply chain specialists when they had the right qualifications. This has taken since 2011 to achieve, 7 years, and it's still going through the system. So these things take a long time. Policies is what we're changing in that context. And so we need to have in mind the longer term view. The next thing I want to talk to you about is what does good look like, or what would we like to walk away from? So on your webinar invitation, there were three documents. One of those was the workforce development, global technical approach, which we affectionately call the two-pager, and the other was the system strengthening two-pager. In the workforce development two-pager, we say this is what we'd like to see as the outcomes of our project, really at the end. That there are strong professionals who assume end-to-end responsibility for the performance of their country's supply chain and can make change happen, and that there are institutionalised policies and procedures to finance, develop, support and retain a sufficient health supply chain workforce. If we were able to achieve this in our countries before the end of our project, we would be very excited. And so I put that to you as an outcome to have a vision for. I'm going to take the moment just to have a look at these two pages so that you can read them after this presentation today. The first one on the screen is the Health System Strengthening Workforce Development two-pager. This two-pager talks about what we envisage as a project for the totality of the supply chain in country. So this is, I apologise, this is the workforce development one. I will correct myself. This is the health system strengthening overall vision. And so we want to see that countries have supply chains that are integrated, optimised, accountable, agile and lean, and supply chain professionals in a culture of quality improvement. So we're looking at this overall complex system. Just for your information, this particular two-pager talks about the technical approaches of all the different areas that we talk about in supply chain management in PSM. And if you scroll further down, for each of these functional areas, there's a little checklist that highlights the main things as a project that we think would be fantastic to see in place for those supply chains to grow. So I'll give you that as homework. For the workforce development two-pager, again, this vision, which I've just described to you, our technical approach I'm going to explain to you a little bit shortly, but this real focus is to make sure that we're looking at things in a systematic way, and that this systematic way looks at multiple parts of the workforce, not just the training, but the other sections, so the planning, the supervision, the professionalization. The other thing we're not going to talk about in this webinar is this section. A number of countries are starting to talk about, and our partners, about whole of labour market approach to human resources. This is recognising that human resources for supply chain are not just in health, that they're also in other areas. And these are the outcomes I mentioned. This is what we are trying to attain for workforce development. And then we go through some activities that we're going to talk about. So again, that's just a summary document for homework. This is a fantastic document to use if you are interacting with your team members to give them an explanation around workforce development, or if you're talking with your USAID counterparts or your government counterparts in country. These are great documents to have that discussion about what makes good capacity development. I think in pictures, and I want to show you a couple of pictures about the bus. One way of thinking about human resources systems is to think about a bus. And if you're thinking about human resources as a bus, then there are four sections of this bus. One is getting the right people on the bus, putting people in their correct seats when they're on the bus, keeping the right people on the bus, and getting the wrong people off the bus. You may have realized that, of course, when we talk about the bus, we're talking about an organization. And in this situation, we're talking about a supply chain organization. And getting the right people on the bus, we need to think about job descriptions, how we select the employees, and the onboarding and orientation process. When people are on the bus or in the organization, we need to be thinking about supportive supervision, performance management, and succession planning, particularly for critical positions. For keeping the right people on the bus, we need to be looking at staff retention and a good work environment, whereas one of the hardest things to do, but very important, is to get the wrong people off the bus. So if you've got poorly managed staff in an organisation, that can be very toxic to that organisation, and that should be managed. Wouldn't it be great if we had the situation in this picture, where everyone was lining up to get inside the organisations, the supply chain organisations in the country we work? That's what we'd like to see in terms of that desired paradigm. The People That Deliver initiative is a global initiative that's really focusing on the professionalisation of supply chain and systematic approaches to supply chain. And they use these particular 5 building blocks to help us understand that capacity development is much more than training. And these 5 building blocks talk about engaged stakeholders. So have we got the right leaders in the right positions to make change happen? But do our bureaucrats and technocrats in government understand the importance of supply chain and the importance of human resources? Do we have the right policy and planning? And we spoke about that as part of the bus idea. Workforce development, not only training, but do we have the right pre-service education in place that meets the local needs? Do we have the right continuing professional development? And do we have the right mentoring and other programs to help people develop their competence? Then for increased performance and retention, it's about having systems that are supported financially as well as with good policy and tools and people with the skills to do performance management. And with retention, you need to think about staff retention. What's interesting is a World Bank report recently, last year, that there is going to be an increased demand for supply chain professionals globally in every sector, not just health. So the drought for supply chain competence is going to get worse. We're going to need more people. So when we talk about retention, we need to think about the local marketplace for human resources. I indicated that we're not talking about this in detail, but it's something we're working on as a project to have more information for you later. But you also need to lift your eyes beyond your own organisation that you're trying to strengthen. The other aspect is professionalisation, building block 5, ensuring that there is appropriate credentials qualified for people to become supply chain accredited, that there is appropriate career structures in place, and people can have the opportunity for a career within supply chain. With our project, we also think about it in these 3 ways, and this is the next 3 parts of the talk today. And that is, we think about things according to human resources policy and planning interventions, education and learning, and management. Just grouping these 5 blocks in another way. And under those headings are some of the other things you can think about. And really, a human resources system needs all of these elements, or all of these elements, or all of the bus elements, in order to be a sustainable system. And so that's particularly the message I want you to take home. At this point in time, I'm going to just stop for a moment and ask if anyone has a question. If you could please type that question in the chat for us. If you have any particular questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. If you've just joined the call, welcome. You've reached the Workforce Development webinar, and I'm Andrew Brown leading this webinar today. I would invite you, if you've just joined the call, to put your name, your country, and your position just in the chat so we can see who's on the call. It makes it richer. Okay, there's no questions coming, but please don't feel you have to wait for those questions. You can type those in at any time. Next part of this webinar is going to talk about assessment. A lot of you have great experience in international development, doing a range of different activities. And everyone is aware that you need to assess a particular gap before you can solve a problem. I'd like to take a few moments to talk to you about a particular tool that we have available to us in the project and across other projects called the People That Deliver Human Resources for Supply Chain Management Assessment Guide and Tool. Now, the purpose of this tool is to document the current state of human resources capacity at the moment in a particular system. So for us, a supply chain organization, and identify opportunities to build up the human resources. So the approach we take is built ownership. So it's an approach that involves engagement with local partners at the government and local donors and implementing partners to work together to adapt some existing survey tools in order to interact with the human resources system within a supply chain to understand it. After understanding the system, then we can deliver a HR analysis, so an overall description or analysis of what's happening, and we can use that analysis to develop a strategy on how to move the human resources agenda forward to agreed goals and an implementation roadmap to move that forward. Then the outputs allow us to direct limited funding, to connect HR with supply chain and to build capacity of supply chain personnel, but more importantly to build the overall capacity of the systems that support those personnel. We're quite excited in Ethiopia at the minute to be working with PFSA to draft their human resources strategy. We've been through this approach. They've done a lot of their groundwork assessment, and we've assisted them as a project with an overall detailed strategy and work plan so that multiple donors can look at funding those particular activities. So I mentioned those particular 5 building blocks around people that deliver. This particular assessment tool uses a couple of different methods, desk audit, interview and focus groups, to look at the different dimensions or the different elements that make up those building blocks. And you'll see some of those listed here. A human resources information system is a computerized system to record the human resources information about people, HR policies, training, retention, etc. So all these are elements that can be explored in a country to see what is strong and what is weak and how to improve it. I'm not going to go into detail on this slide. It'll be a little bit small on your screen, but I wanted to just point out that there are 3 phases. This can take different amount of time depending on how much of the system you wish to assess, but typically a minimum around 4-week period, perhaps a little longer to do something like this, at least a couple of weeks in country. Phase 1 is the preparation, where we do a lot of groundwork of desk audit as well as orientating individuals who are going to help collect data in country. The second is implementation, where the assessment team will conduct the interviews, the focus groups, and collect the data, and then the analysis and the report. So a particular sort of standard sort of system when it comes to assessment and so on. But what's exciting is this goes deep on the human resources aspect. So people know that HR is an issue, but this tool helps countries or helps organizations to assess supply chain systems to see the strengths and weaknesses around those 5 building blocks, as I mentioned. So you end up with a supply chain profile, focus groups, and interviews. I'm not going to go into the detail of how that's unfolded in this webinar, but what I'd like you to show you is what the data looks like. I'm a very visual person. I love pictures. Now, the data from the HR assessment tool comes out in this pretty picture in an Excel sheet that's easy to populate. They have these coloured petals. Each coloured petal represents one of the 5 building blocks, and each of the items on the side are the different dimensions that make up that building block. What you're aiming for is as much colour as possible. So this is an example of a great system. This is just a textbook one. Let's go to what the countries really look like. So this was 2 countries done in Africa. We're not going to name them. But what this demonstrates, you can't see very clearly the small writing, but at the top, the key on each of these represents the 5 building blocks. And these particular spider webs, I call it a spider graph, really shows you the strength and weakness of the 2 countries. So this particular country here is weak in all areas, but particularly weak in this aqua color area, which is the professionalization on this color coding. Whereas this country is quite strong in the brown, blue area to a little bit less orange, but also very weak in the aqua area. So this is a great visual diagram that can help to explain to people again why capacity development is more than just training what the different elements are that make that up and what that looks like. And personally, I found this very effective when talking to PFSA, showing them a nice colourful graph and explaining the different blocks and where we needed to do some work. Out of interest, this particular tool has been done in all these countries, plus many more, Sudan, and a range of other countries not listed, but by a number of organisations. So Psm, we've used it in a couple of different countries. Global Fund is currently working with people that deliver to do this assessment in a number of countries. So just wanted to take the time to point this out to you. Just an example of a couple of key results from some of those countries. The particular assessment tool identified the number of staff required to run a unit. The results were used to leverage the introduction of a new logistics unit, improve recruitment and develop a recruitment strengthening toolkit, and open the door to other supply chain strategy conversations. And I've given you the example of Ethiopia, where the conversation has clearly moved to a full human resources strategy. Dr. Loco, the director, the Director General, has asked for a full comprehensive strategy to cover all of the 5 areas, because he now understands that all those building block areas in human resources are important, not just the training one. Again, just an opportunity to remind you that if you have any questions as we're moving along in the webinar, please feel free to type that in the chat so we can all see, and I'll address those questions as we move along together. This final part of the webinar, or next to final part, is I want to help orientate you to our a 10-pager, which is our third handout or attachment associated with this webinar invitation. We're grouping our interventions in workforce development in 3 areas: policy and planning, education and learning, and human resources management interventions. So I want to bring up this particular, what we affectionately call the 10-pager, which, if you're good at maths, you'll quickly realize that there's a lot more than 10 pages here, but we call it a 10-pager. So some of this material we've already covered, which is about the purpose of the 10-pager, the what and the why, our vision of workforce development system strengthening, questions from the field, the technical approaches we're taking, our innovations and our ways of thinking, and so this just repeats that. But please consider this as a resource document. There are several hundred links here, and I'm going to show you some of those, to tools, guidance, and experience of other countries that I think you're going to find very helpful. And what I'd like to do is to focus on a couple of things. I'm just going to scroll down quickly to page 6. So if you get a bit giddy, close your eyes for a moment, because I don't want to make you giddy. So some people like to think about things in terms of supply chain maturity. Now, as a project, we're still developing a supply chain maturity model that we're looking at in conjunction with USAID. But for the purposes of this document, I've simply stated that supply chains, very oversimply, you can have an ad hoc, organized, or an integrated supply chain. So moving from left to right are systems that are more mature. Now, I want you to think about workforce as an overall system that needs to mature for it to be sustainable. And I just want to take the time to read this to you. So in an ad hoc system, roles are not clearly defined. Emphasis is on short-term training to improve competence, limited supply chain staff, often no dedicated staff, people are doing supply chain as part of an extra job. We would call that ad hoc. Organized. So roles and responsibilities are clarified and documented. Emphasis moves to improving the systematic management of people and developing of institutions, for example, human resources institutions and academic institutions. And then increasing efforts to capacitate existing cadres. And then we move across to the more mature or integrated systems we're looking for, where we've got high-performing teams are formed and supply chain managers are empowered. We've got HR systems fully supported from management of staff, from hiring to exit, and individuals are on a clear trajectory to professional supply chain management career. I personally find that thinking about an overall human resources system as a system that needs to mature from the left to the right is another good way of trying to understand workforce in a particular organization. So I'll leave that for you to consider. Within the document, it's set out like this talk is set out, looking at root cause analysis, so what are the root causes or the performance gaps, and then what are the interventions that we would need to undertake in order to address those gaps. I've already spoken to you about this next section, which is about diagnosing gaps. So again, just give me a moment while we just scroll down here. I will note as we pass that this particular diagram is the people that deliver a theory of change for human resources development. And this is another fantastic document that will be published shortly. I've put this picture in here because it's really helpful. When you're talking to people to understand that if we want to optimize workforce in supply chain, we need to think about staffing, skills, working conditions, and motivation. It's not just training, which is in here. So this is just another way of trying to wave that flag that says capacity development is not just training, and give you clear insights on the other elements that make that up. The page we're just going over is the other tools that you can look at for performance gaps. So again, just excuse me while I just scroll down. Again, at this point, emphasize there's a full report here from Namibia, Dominican Republic, then Tanzania, Zanzibar, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, all where they've done human resources diagnosis, analyses, and subsequent reports. And I think you may find that helpful if you're interested in what other countries have been up to. Okay, here we are, we've arrived. So this is the policy and planning intervention section. Now, within this, what we're calling the 10-pager, they're all set out the same way. So we're now going to talk about 3 sections. We're going to talk about this policy and planning as one. We talk about key approaches, just very briefly. What are the main things we want to think about when we think about policy and planning? We have a section on guidance and tools, where we clearly link, and I tested all the links 2 weeks ago, so they should all work. Links to a whole range of tools and guidance. And then the final section is country application, where there are actually examples from countries that you may find helpful as you look at your own context. So in this situation, when we're talking about policy and planning, so policy and planning are looking for transformational long-term sustainability. And we're looking at the systematic issues. So a good example would be in Mozambique, where they realized that the current structure of human resources didn't give sufficient recognition to supply chain specialities. And so in that context, they wanted to change the public service so that they could recognize supply chain as a speciality. And so they're working on doing that. Another one would be in Ethiopia and PFSA, for example, where they want to develop a retention policy, a staff retention policy, and they want to review all of their performance management policies to make sure that they are consistent with what should be done, and then also that their staff have the skills to do those. So other policies is we can do things like assess the workload to see how many staff are required. We can look at, I mentioned, creating new cadres. We can look at defining career pathways. So this section is just designed to think about various policy and planning interventions. Of course, you may know which interventions you wish to move ahead with, so you could choose from this menu. On the other hand, if you don't know, then you would always start with a human resources supply chain assessment first to make sure you understood the human resources context. And I've mentioned those countries there to you. The next one is the education and learning interventions. And again, I just want to touch on a couple of high points and give you this document as your homework to look into more detail. You'll note carefully that I've not used the word training very often, and particularly not even in the headings. And that is because most places we go, still after a number of years, we start the capacity development discussion and immediately people talk about training. I think I've said that enough in this particular webinar to hopefully brainwash you, so every time you think about capacity development and training, you're thinking more deeply. But when we're thinking about learning specifically, you'll notice some of the words that are noted in here as well as in the approaches get you to think about, well, what are the competencies that you want to train about? There's no point doing training if you don't clearly understand the competencies needed to do the job. So are job descriptions up to date? Is there a competency framework that actually documents how work should be done? Competency frameworks are fantastic documents to help guide the revision of job descriptions, the revision of pre-service training, in-service training, etc. When training or education of any sort is undertaken, has it been constructed properly? Has it been constructed with consideration to the local context, using adult learning principles? Are the materials being developed in such a way that they can be institutionalized within an academic or other institution for ongoing use? And I want to draw your attention to this particular line here. Often, I was part of a WHO group that reviewed the training of the trainers' methodologies that they were using. Unfortunately, the final report was not published, but there was two criticisms of all the existing training in the health sector. One of those criticisms was that very few people looked at the quality of the people doing the training, whether it was at university or whether it was a short-term course. The idea is that just because someone is a technical expert does not mean that they have education and training competencies. And so you need to make sure that you are assessing your trainers to make sure they've got those competencies and giving them the opportunity to develop them if they haven't. The other is, well, how is that training that's taking place actually impacting on the workplace? And this is an important area, and a lot of donors are asking this question, so I wanted to emphasize it today. And that is that if you are doing training of any kind, then donors more and more are starting to ask, how did that training that you conduct impact the workplace to improve work outcomes? And so we need to put our thinking caps on to thinking about that, so we can do before and after workplace assessments about what's happening, looking at particular supply chain indicators to see if there's an improvement. You can do staff interviews before and after. There's a range of different methodologies. In this particular area, methodologies are still being developed, so you won't find a lot in the resource section, but something I'm happy to talk about offline. So when we talk about these educational learning interventions, I've highlighted a couple of things that are really dear to my heart in regard to this. But one of the big ones is having the right pre-service education in place. And that takes a group of people to think about things critically. And it does take some time to work with universities to make changes. The other is short courses, and thinking about my challenge to people for short courses is how can you make them sustainable by linking them with institutions, and how can you make everything work applicable and ensure that there is some sort of measurement about how things are affecting the work environment. But remember, if you're just doing education activities just by itself, then you are not going to create a sustainable human resources system. In this section, we've got lots of different tools. There's the competency framework from People That Deliver. There's how to create training for performance. How do you strengthen universities, so strengthening schools. Interesting on bottlenecks and best buys, how you scale up health worker education in a country. Pre-service education methodologies. There is a training guide for supply chain management training. There's a great report on how to scale up education. There's a great report on how to improve the quality of training. A lot of discussion about e-learning at the moment, and there's a great document here that discusses e-learning for undergraduate health professional education, a review from WHO. Lots and lots of different materials. And one of the more recent ones to point out is if you want a quick overview of a range of different ways that you can help develop competence in a country, then this fantastic article from SciAps creates a good overview. If you want to dig deeper in this particular topic, then we've got case studies from Namibia, Ethiopia, Liberia, and Sudan and Malawi here, which will give you some detailed understanding of what's been happening in those contexts. The third area was management interventions as the third lot of activities that can be conducted. Remember, I was saying that from this list you may see things that you know are necessary in your country, and so you might be able to move straight to doing an activity. But if you're not clear on what's happening, then what you need to do is you need to do a HR assessment to make that call. So here, a number of root causes of performance gaps can include lack of performance expectations or feedback, low motivation, poor accountability, limited physical resources or human resources, and work overload. So these sorts of things require management interventions. So not just the policy changes we spoke about earlier, but doing things like improving recruitment and hiring processes, reconstructing compensation packages, making sure job descriptions are clear, particular job aids correct and friendly, strengthening performance monitoring, performance incentive schemes, etc. So this is the more technical aspects of human resources policies and procedures, and making them work is what these interventions are about. Again, there is quite a number of tools here. I want to highlight a couple for you which I think are very interesting. One is this rapid retention survey. It allows you to work with staff in an organization to find out what are the things that motivate them and could keep them more engaged in work over a longer period of time. How to recruit supply chain professionals, a great guide for improving recruitment systems, a great guide on how to improve gender situation in the workplace. We've just done some good work in Ethiopia with local counterparts in this regard. For performance management systems, there's a large amount of work being done on different incentive systems and evidence for those systems that you might find interesting. The other area where there's lots of tools that I want to draw your attention to is a range of tools on supportive supervision, how to improve supportive supervision systems and procedures. And then the last one here is about retention. This particular document looks about staff retention in remote areas, but a lot of the things that are talked about there can be applied in a lot of other areas as well. And then for your reference, there is a range of, there's 2 case studies from Namibia, and Mozambique. So I just went over that quickly, but just a reminder where we are looking in this technical approach to workforce development, something we're calling the 10-pager. And that is the reference document that I was using to give you that quick overview. As we move to the end of our time together, I want to talk to you about some resources. One of the most important things that you can be doing is not only developing your own competence and the competence of your team members, but also the competence of government counterparts. And there's quite a number of things that you can do and that are free and some that are not free in order to improve your competence. Now, in that document we were just in, the whole last couple of pages are several pages of detailed resources. I just want to highlight some here and then encourage you to go back to that at your leisure. Before I talk about resources specifically, I want to mention an approach that you can take, or you can get your teams to take, to help improve their competence in a systematic way. And this is something that we're trialing shortly in Nigeria. I'm working with SMART in Nigeria to move this forward. So on the internet, for a small fee, Pamela Steele Associates and Empower School of Health, although Empower do have a free version as well, have tools where you can do self-assessment against on the internet about supply chain competence and end up with a report that tells you how good you are in certain areas of supply chain management. Shows you your strengths and shows you your weaknesses. This is a fantastic idea and a tool to help you understand where you need to invest your time and money to improve your competence. You can also imagine if you use these with teams, you can get an understanding of the overall team, their competence, their weaknesses and strengths, and an idea of how to spend your valuable time if you're going to move that forward. You can also use job descriptions or an existing competency framework to get people to self-reflect without the use of online tools. But there's no doubt that online tools are very helpful. Once you've identified gaps, staff, whether it's yourself or others, should identify their gaps, and then talk with a supervisor in order to develop a staff development plan. Now, staff development plans, you can use self-study, you can do courses, you can do mentoring, all sorts of things, but we don't have unlimited money and we don't have unlimited time. And so using this approach helps you to focus on the competencies that you're weakest in. Always a good idea, great idea to do this process, step 4, with a supervisor. It could be a mentor or a supervisor or a colleague, and do it together so you can encourage each other and see that you're on the right track. So just to point out that this is that little process there. Now, what you've all been waiting for, here come the resources. Probably the most important is to get connected to a professional organisation. And if you're not connected to IAPHL, then you need to be. It's an international professional association of 400 plus members from 140 countries. It's free. It's an online forum with larger exchanges of information around many different aspects of supply chain management. Please join IAPHL. In addition to IAPHL, you can join People That Deliver if you want to have a much deeper understanding of human resources in supply chain. You can join eDrug if you want to have more understanding of pharmaceutical systems. eDrug goes beyond supply chain to look at use of medicines, quality of medicines, and medicines adverse effects monitoring. Supply Chain Brain is a private sector forum if you want to see what private sector is doing. And in PSM, we're developing our own in-depth platform to share information and resources. You may not know there are free textbooks online, and these are 3 free textbooks that you can get access to. By the way, these are all active links that when you get the slide deck, you can use yourself, but also all of these resources are available in the 10-pager. There's training videos that you can watch about supply chain, which are available. If you're a Commonics employee, you will get access to funding. That funding varies, but it's at least several hundred US dollars that I understand is available yearly through your Human Resources Department for helping you to develop your competence. So here are some of the 2 of the ways. There are many others. You could use that. There's the Fritz Institute and Empower both have academic courses on supply chain, but there's also a whole range of free e-learning opportunities through those repositories listed on screen. If you see that you have a long-term career as a supply chain professional, then you may wish to get a professional certification. And there are many organizations that do this. If you're from the US, you've probably heard of APIX a lot. If you're in Africa, you've probably heard of SAPIX a lot. If you're in Europe, you've probably heard of CILT. Most people have heard of SIPS, and a number of people have heard of Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals. These are particular professional certifications that you can undertake in order to have an internationally recognized certificate. This is separate to an academic process. Again, just quickly, I'm orientating you on a couple of things for you to go and do homework later as we finish. There's a range of resources and tools on these platforms, which are very large platforms that you can look at. I wanted to point out that I'm very shortly going to be advertising and doing a 5-module series. I'm calling it the Workforce Development PSM Certificate Series. I'm going to be touching each of these 5 topics on the screen. I'm going to be doing this in such a way that you'll be required to do 3 hours pre-reading. I'm going to do an hour tutorial on the Skype, and you'll have at least an assignment about 1 hour in length to complete. And people who successfully complete all the assignments, I'll give a certificate of competence to. So this will be coming up the end of this month and into next month. The aim is this is specifically for people in health system strengthening roles or capacity development roles that want to dig much deeper than we have today in these particular areas. So I've gone very fast, and time is always the enemy, but very quickly what I've done is really help you to understand what a systematic approach to human resources should look like, challenge you to think about your country context in terms of what is the legacy that you want to leave behind, give you a bit of detail about a tool that is accessible to you for diagnosing human resources performance gaps, the HR assessment guide and tool, and then speak briefly but give you a very good resource about interventions on policy and planning, education and learning, and management, and then close by giving you a whole range of resources that you can get access to for your own personal development or for your team or as you interact with governments. It's been a great time together, and those of you who can stick around, please, we're now going to open for questions, and I would encourage you to type your question into the conversation. I'll stay online for the next 15 minutes, so that if anyone has any questions they want to ask, then please feel free to do so. Otherwise, please do not hesitate to email me if you have any questions or you'd like any further detail on anything we've discussed today, and the floor is open. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, you feel free. If you want to put a comment or question in the chat, then that would also be of assistance. Over to you. And if you've got to go, then have a good day. Please feel free to type in any questions that you may have. Or if you would like to unmute yourself and say your question orally, you're very welcome.